dog interrupted the funeral, barking furiously nonstop at the casket. When the people tried to listen to find out why the dog was barking so much, the priest became very nervous, and then this woman discovers a shocking secret. Shakonde town was like any other small town in Nigeria, alive with the sounds of people going about their daily business, children playing, and neighbors sharing gossip. It was a place where everyone knew everyone's name, and no secret stayed hidden for long. At every corner, people greeted each other with a smile or a friendly wave. There a young woman, Madame Mima, who ran a small provision shop on the street. She was a very beautiful and friendly young woman who loved and helped a lot of people. Everyone in the town knew Mama Mema. At the center of the town was a small church. It was the only church in Shakonde town, and it was managed by a young priest, Father Nduka. Though he was new to the town, he quickly became a part of the Shakon town. From the day he arrived, his sermon had drawn in a crowd to the church. His service to the community was so good that people from neighboring town began to worship there so that they can get some of his benevolence. He gave out scholarships to children that couldn't afford to pay their tuition, bought gifts for babies, and even gave money to struggling mothers. But as perfect as the priest seemed, something strange was happening that nobody but a dog seemed to notice. Mamemima, who lived close to the church, had a big dog. Normally he was quiet and friendly, wagging its tail at familiar faces and barking only when strangers passed by. But ever since Father Nduka arrived, the dog had changed. Every time Father Nduka passed Mamemema's compound on his way to visit the villagers and church members, the dog barked fiercely, growling and pacing, as though it was in the presence of something dangerous. At first, Madame Ma thought it was just the dog being protective of its territory, but soon it became clear that something was unsettling the animal. The more the priest came and went from the compounds, the more agitated the dog became. Madame Ma spent most of her mornings at the church, cleaning and taking care of the priest's home before going to her shop, a routine that she had with other priests that were sent to Shakon town. A few days after the priest arrived at Yakonde, Mamame Ma walked over and introduced herself to Father Nduka. Something was different about the priest. There was an energy about him, an aura of mystery that drew people in. Though the priest had met many women in his travels, none had ever had the same effect on him. The moment he met Madame Ma, something stirred within him. He quickly turned his gaze away, feeling a flush of guilt rise in his chest. He had made a vow to stay pure in his calling, to keep his heart free from women. Yet here, before him, was a woman who seemed to have everything he had ever dreamt of, pure, devoted, and very beautiful. Father Nduka spent the following weeks trying to suppress the feelings that he had for Madame Emma. He threw himself into his duties at the church and visiting a lot of members to stay busy. Yet despite his efforts, he couldn't stop thinking about Mamema. The more he tried to avoid her, the more drawn to her he became. Mema was so unaware of the effect she had on Father Nduka. She continued with her life, not knowing what was happening. She was very trusting and naive. She had no reason to suspect Father Nduka of any ill intentions. So she continued to help him, go to his house when no one else was there, cleaning his house, preparing food for him, washing his clothes, and helping wherever she could. It was one afternoon while Madame Aimee was in the kitchen helping Father Nduka to cook some meals for the week. The priest walked into the kitchen, stood quietly and watched Mamem. She was beautiful and curvy. Mamema, not knowing that the priest was watching her, was singing happily and moving her waist side to side while cooking as though nothing could go wrong. She was so relaxed as if she was in her home. The priest had fought his lust for Madame Mema long enough. He had pushed aside his feelings for her, convinced that it was simply an unholy temptation that he needed to suppress. But when he saw Mamema bend over, organizing the cabinet, her hair flowing down her back in gentle waves, something inside him snapped. As he watched her dancing around the kitchen with her perfectly curvy body, the overwhelming desire to have her, to claim her as his own, took control. He moved toward her, his heart pounding in his chest. Before Madame Mema could react, he grabbed her from behind, forcing her against him. She froze in shock, her mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. "Mama Mema," he whispered, his voice thick with desperation. "You don't know what you're doing to me." But Madame Ma, in that moment, understood all too well. The man she had trusted, the man she had seen as a holy figure, was the very one who had violated her. She fought back, but his grip was too strong. His breath was hot on her neck, and she could feel his desperation in every movement. In the end, she could not save herself, but surrender to the violence of the moment. The next few days were very difficult for Madame Ma. She locked herself away in her house, avoiding the church, avoiding the world. Her heart was shattered, and she felt as though everything she had believed in was a lie. She had been betrayed by the person she trusted the most, the priest. In the weeks that followed, Madame Ma withdrew even further. She would not leave her house except for the necessary trips to the market, and even then, she avoided speaking to anyone. Her once bright and radiant smile had faded into a hollow mask of sorrow. Her loyal dog stayed by her side, sensing the deep sadness within her. The dog seemed to watch over her with an almost human understanding, barking fiercely whenever the priest passed by, as though he also knew the evil that was within Father Nduka's soul. "I don't know why this dog keep barking at the priest," one of the villagers said one day, shaking his head. "It never acted like this before. This dog is usually calm and friendly, and it had seen this priest every day for months, and yet the reaction never changed every time the priest passed by. It was as if the dog was warning the town about something no one else could see. To everyone, the priest was perfect. He supported the villagers, ran the church, and went about his business like everyone else." It was almost a month after the incident that Madame Ma realized she was pregnant. She was very sad and worried about what to do, but she couldn't bring herself to abort it. No matter the circumstances, she would protect this child because it was innocent and pure, unlike the man who had fathered it. Madame Ma knew she had to confront Father Nduka. She had to tell him, even though she was terrified of what might happen. He owed her an explanation. So she went to his house one evening, her heart heavy with the weight of the rape and pregnancy. Father Nduka greeted her at the door, forcing a smile on his face. He had seen the change in her. Her eyes were now scared and full of pain. The guilt he had been suppressing for weeks bubbled up to the surface. "Madame Ma," he said, his voice tight, "I want to say I'm sorry for what happened." Tears welled up in Madame Ma's eyes as she blurted out the truth. "I'm pregnant, and it's yours." Father Nduka stepped back as if he had been struck. He felt a lot of guilt for what he did to Madame Ma and was hoping to beg her to forgive and forget, but now he was in more trouble. "Please," he begged, "I cannot have a child. I am a priest. Please, we need to get rid of the pregnancy." Madame Ma shook her head. "I won't kill my child. I won't commit another sin. You should have thought about that before violating me." The priest's face twisted in frustration and fear. He had not planned for this. Desperation gripped him as he tried to convince Madame Ma to do the unthinkable, to get rid of the baby, to erase the evidence of his crime. But Madame Ma remained firm in her decision. She would raise this child alone if she had to. Something subtle began to change. The warmth that used to fill the priest as he walked through the community began to fade, and his behavior became more distant, more unsettling. He was so distant that even when people walked past and greeted him or waved at him, he did not respond to them. He was blank, avoiding contact with anyone who came near him. He only focused on his service at church. As soon as service was over, he would hurriedly rush home to avoid interacting with people. The villagers began to notice as well, one by one. They began to whisper among themselves. Every evening, he would go by Madame Ma's house, trying to talk her into getting rid of the pregnancy. The dog would go crazy, barking with its tail stiff, as if it wanted to tear him into shreds. Madame Ma refused to listen to him. "I am keeping this pregnancy," she said firmly. After a lot of failed persuasion, the priest turned to a more sinister plan. He went over to Madame Ma's house to invite her over for a talk. "Madame Ma, please, come to my house tomorrow night. I want to speak to you about keeping the baby, to make things right. Let me explain myself. Please." The urgency in his tone was strange, but what unsettled her most was how quickly he had shifted from the man who had wanted an abortion to someone begging to keep the baby. "I think I would like you to keep the baby. Please come by tomorrow evening so we can talk about it," the priest said. Madame Ma was very happy to hear that. She wanted to keep her baby. "Thank you for doing this. I will be there tomorrow evening," she said, smiling. The next day she closed her shop early so she could prepare to go for the meeting with the priest. She was desperate to have him in the baby's life, that she didn't think about any danger of going over to his house again. As she was heading out, it was a little dark, and her dog followed her closely as if it was protecting her from something. When she arrived at the church compound where the priest lived, he was waiting at the door for her. He greeted her and opened the door to welcome her in. The dog hid beside the flower bush by the house. "I just got back from visitation. I made dinner so we can eat and talk," he said. Manamema, who had not eaten since breakfast, was happy to have some food. Frunduka set the table and brought in some of the food he made in 2 different plates. He gave Manamema a plate and kept one for himself. Everything seemed perfect, and she did not feel any tension between them. "I really would love to be a part of the baby's life. Please let me know where I can help," Frunduka said. "Eat up," he said. Everything felt normal. The food was rich, the spices flavorful, and Manamema relaxed and let her guard down. But as she continued eating, an unsettling sensation began to rise within her. A deep, dull ache started in her stomach, a tightening that was unmistakable. She put her hand to her belly, but the discomfort only grew worse. The room around her began to spin, a sharp pain shooting through her stomach towards her lower abdomen. She twisted her face and held her stomach, trying to endure the pain. "Are you okay?" Father Nduka asked. "Yes, I'm fine. Just a little stomach ache," she replied. She nodded, though her vision blurred, and the pain intensified, spreading like wildfire. She felt an intense, sharp cramping, like something was tearing at her insides. "Mama, what's happening?" Father Nduka asked, but his voice didn't sound concerned. Instead, there was something strange in the way he asked, almost as though he was waiting for this to happen. Mamamima stood up suddenly. She clutched her stomach, her hands shaking as she stumbled toward the door, trying to run out for help. But the world around her was spinning faster now. Her legs were weak, and she collapsed onto the floor. And then she felt it, the warm trickle of blood. She realized what was happening. Father Nduka had poisoned her. He had poisoned her food to force her into a miscarriage, taking away the pregnancy. Manamema's body trembled as she tried to steady herself. The priest had planned this all along. The food, the invitation, everything had been part of his twisted plan. You did this," she managed to speak, looking up at him with horror in her eyes. "You poisoned me. You wanted to kill my baby." Father Nduka stood there, his face eerily calm. "It was never supposed to be this way," he said, his voice almost cold. "You should have never kept that pregnancy, Manamema. This is for the best." His words were like daggers to her heart. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't even remorseful. He was cold, calculating, as though her life and the life of the baby meant nothing. Manamema's blood began to gush out as she struggled to stand. "No, you won't get away with this. I'll fight. I'll survive, Father Nduka. You'll never take this baby from me. Never." But the pain was overwhelming, and she felt herself slipping into unconsciousness. Father Nduka stood still in the dimly lit room, his hands trembling as he looked at the weak body Mama lying on the floor in the pool of her own blood before him. The mission had been successful. She had lost the child, but now a new problem was before him. Mama wasn't dead. She was weak, barely clinging to life, and that was a problem. Father Nduka knew he had to act quickly. The longer she lived, the greater the risk of her remembering what had happened. She could wake up, start asking questions, and ruin everything he had worked so hard to keep hidden. He had no choice. He quickly pulled her bloodied clothes from her. His stomach churned at the sight, but he forced himself to remain calm. The clothes, stained and soaked in the blood of her miscarriage, had to be thrown away, far away where no one else could find them. If anyone discovered what he had done, it would be the end of him. Outside, the night was quiet and dark. Father Nduka moved quickly, walking to the side of his house where the ground was soft and loose. He had prepared this spot earlier, knowing that when the time came, he would need to bury the evidence. As he dug, his heart pounded in his chest. The grave was shallow, and he worked quickly, putting the bloodied clothes into the hole, covering them with dirt, and pressing the earth down tightly. He paused and looked around nervously to make sure nobody was watching. But what he didn't see, what he couldn't know, was that his every move had been watched. Mama Mema's loyal dog had been lying at the front of the house, quietly waiting for Mama Mema to come out. But instead it saw Father Nduka walking too. But what he didn't see, what he couldn't know, was that his every move had been watched. Mama Mema's loyal dog had been lying at the front of the house, quietly waiting for Mama Mema to come out. But instead it saw Father Nduka walking to the side of his house to dig the ground. The dog had no choice but to keep watching, his instincts telling him that something dangerous was unfolding. After burying the clothes, Father Nduka walked back to his house, his mind already moving to the next task. He had to get Mama Mema out of his house. Mama Mema, weak and barely conscious, still lay on the cold floor. Father Nduka hesitated for a moment. There was no turning back now. His heart pounding in his chest, he carried Madame Mema's frail, lifeless body in his arms. He had to get her home, had to make it look like nothing had happened, like she had died quietly in her sleep. His walk slowly in the middle of the night as he approached Madame Mema's house, his every movement filled with purpose and hidden terror. As he reached the door of Madame Mema's small home, he hesitated, looking over his shoulder. The street was empty and no one was watching. He pushed the door open with a creak. The house was quiet. Father Nduka stepped inside, carefully laying Madame Mema's body on her bed. His hands trembled as he adjusted her limbs, trying to arrange her as if she had simply died in her sleep. He arranged the blankets around her body, trying to make her look peaceful, as if nothing had happened. But the priest was not done yet. He remembered the dog. He looked at the corner where the dog usually stayed to see if the dog was watching. But the dog was not there. He felt relief Father Nduka had achieved his goal. Or so he thought. The dog, however, was not fooled. The dog had seen everything. The next morning in Shakonda town was different. The air was thick with tension, as though the earth itself could sense the tragedy that had already unfolded. Madame Mema's small shop was usually the heart of the morning bustle. People came by for fresh bread, milk, and other things to make breakfast. But today the shop was eerily quiet. The door was shut tight, and there was no sign of Madame Mema. Mama Mema's loyal dog stood outside the shop, barking relentlessly. The dog was pacing in circles, his fur bristling, his ears twitching in frustration, his eyes scanning the street as though he was waiting for someone to appear, someone who wasn't coming. It was unusual for Madame Mema to be late, and even more so for dog to be out here barking without her. Usually Madame Mema would have been the first to calm him down. But today, the dog's frantic barking seemed to echo through the streets, making people pause and wonder. After a few minutes of trying to ignore the noise, a neighbor, Mrs. Uso, who lived just a few doors down from Madama's house, couldn't stand it any longer. The persistent barking got on her nerves, and something deep in her gut told her that something was terribly wrong. Madame Mema had never left her dog out like this. Mrs. Uso stood at her door looking at the dogs. She tried to call the dogs, but the dog only barked louder. Without hesitation, she walked across the street to Madame Mema's shop. As she approached the door, she noticed that it was slightly open. Maybe she just overslept, Mrs. Uso said to herself. She pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. The shop was silent, the usual smell of baked bread and cooking spices replaced with an unsettling stillness. Mrs. Uzo's eyes scanned the room, looking for Madame Mema, but she couldn't see her anywhere. "Ma Mema," she called softly, her voice shaking slightly. "Ma Mema, are you here?" But there was no answer. "Where is she?" Mrs. Uzo said, kneeling down to the dog, who was still barking uncontrollably. The dog whined and tugged at her clothes, pulling her toward the back of the shop. Without thinking, Mrs. Uzo followed. The dog led her to a small door that led into the back room, Madame Mema's private room where she lived. When Mrs. Uzo pushed the door open, she froze. The sight that greeted her was one of pure horror. There, lying motionless on the bed, was Madame Mema. Her face was pale, and her eyes closed as though she was simply sleeping. But the stillness of her body, the unnatural position of her limbs, told a different story. Madame Mema was not sleeping. She was dead. Mrs. Uzo's breath caught in her throat. Her legs felt weak, and for a moment, she thought she might faint. She staggered backward, her hand pressing against her mouth to stifle a scream. but it was no use. "Mama! Mama!" she cried, her voice breaking with disbelief. "No, this can't be true." The dog began to bark even louder, almost as if he too was grieving. Mrs. Uzo's knees buckled, and she fell to the floor beside the bed, her hands trembling as she touched Madame Emma's cold skin. Tears blurred her vision, and she didn't know what to do. She knew she had to tell someone or everyone. This was too much to process, too sudden, too shocking. She ran out of the room, her heart pounding in her chest as she rushed back out into the street. "Help! Someone help!" she screamed. "Mama is dead!" The words spilled out of her like a flood, and the town seemed to pause in disbelief. People ran out from their homes, hearing the frantic cries and the urgency in her voice. One by one, the townspeople gathered outside Madame Emma's shop, their faces filled with confusion and concern. Madame Emma, the kind, gentle soul who had been so much a part of Chacon Town, was gone. Father Nduka became even more nervous and tried to shut the villagers down, but more people spoke out loudly asking him to pause the service so they can listen to the dog. Father Nduka became uncomfortable and began to realize that the situation was slipping out of control. He raised his hands asking for silence. "Enough of this nonsense!" Father Nduka barked, his fist clenched in frustration. "This is ridiculous. We must bury Madame Ma now. These animals are simply causing a scene." But at this point, no one was listening to him anymore. One elder, who had known Madame Ma since childhood, stepped forward. "Father, I believe the dogs are trying to tell us something. Animals can sense things we can't. Perhaps there's something we've missed." Father Nduka's face turned red with anger. He stepped forward again, his eyes flashing with impatience. "I will not tolerate this superstition any longer. We will not allow the funeral to be delayed because of some barking dogs. If you choose to listen to these animals, then I will not conduct this service." Finally, an elder, a respected woman in the village, spoke with conviction. "We will listen to the dogs," she said firmly. "They have a sixth sense. We owe it to Madame Emma to understand what they are trying to tell us." "I saw her last night," someone exclaimed. "She was perfectly fine. She was helping me with some errands." "But the dog, her dog, he's been barking all night," another person said, shaking their head. "What happened?" And then someone else whispered, "Please call Fr. Nduka so he can help us." Father Nduka had quickly arrived on the scene, his face calm and unreadable. When he walked into the room where Madame Emma's lifeless body lay, the dog immediately went wild. He began to bark furiously. The priest prayed over Madame Ma's body and asked the family members to prepare for funeral. The day arrived for her funeral, and the villagers gathered to lay her to rest. It was very cloudy and sorrowful. The villagers cried as they could not believe Madame Emma was gone. Father Nduka, however, remained calm. His face was impassive, and his hands were steady as he began to pray over Madame Emma's casket. His words were soft and soothing, offering comfort to the mourners. He spoke with authority, as though he knew exactly what needed to be done. "The Lord calls those who are ready, and he shall guide her spirit to eternal peace," Father Nduka said, his voice deep and steady as he finished the prayers. As he stood at the foot of the casket, preparing to bless it one final time before lowering the casket into the ground, Madame Ma's dog had somehow gotten out of its cage. It ran towards the casket, barking so wildly and frantic. The villagers gasped in surprise and fear as the animals charged forward, its eyes wide with terror, and teeth open. The dog circled the casket, barking aggressively as if they were trying to protect it. It jumped at the wooden sides of the casket. The villagers began to murmur in fear. "The dog has never been this aggressive," they said. The villagers rushed to restrain the dog, pulling it away from the casket, but it became more aggressive. "Father, what's happening?" a woman from the crowd asked, her voice trembling. "Why are the dogs acting like this? They've never been like this before." Father Nduka lifted his hands, trying to maintain control of the situation. "Don't mind the dogs," he said, his tone dismissive. "It's nothing. Animals can sense things we don't understand. They're simply unsettled. There's no reason for alarm." But his words did nothing to calm the crowd. The dogs continued to bark. "This is no ordinary grief," one elder said, his voice trembling. "The dogs are trying to tell us something. They're not behaving like this for no reason." Another voice echoed the same sentiment. Could it be that something unnatural happened? Something that these animals know but we don't? But Father Nduka silenced them with a wave of his hand, his face tight with frustration. Enough of this superstition, he snapped. The funeral must go on. The villagers watched in silence, their hearts heavy with confusion and dread. What had really happened to Madame Emma? Why is her dog acting so strangely like this? When it was time to lower the casket into the ground, the dog refused to let anyone touch the casket. This is very strange. We must find out what is going on with the dog, a villager said. Father Nduka's eyes widened with disbelief. He opened his mouth to protest, but the crowd had already begun to shift. The elders led the way, and the villagers, now united in their decision, followed. We will not proceed with the burial until we understand what the dog are trying to tell us, the elder said, her voice steady and unwavering. Father Nduka was visibly shaken. He knew that if the villagers listened to the dog, it could unravel everything he had worked to conceal. With no choice but to relent, he watched in helpless silence as the group moved away from the grave and toward the dog. Suddenly the dog ran ahead. The villagers followed, trusting the dog's instincts as they made their way toward Father Nduka's residence, a small house tucked away at the corner of the churchyard. As they approached the priest's home, the dog's barking grew louder, and the dog ran to the side of the house and stopped at the spot where the priest buried Madame Ma's clothes. The villagers, following the dog's lead, began to dig into the soft earth beside the house. They dug furiously, the dirt flying from their hands, their eyes wide with anticipation. And then they hit something hard. One of the villagers, an older man with trembling hands, reached into the hole and pulled out a bundle wrapped in a cloth. The group gasped in unison as the contents of the cloth were revealed. It was a set of bloodied clothes, Mema's favorite Ankara dress that she wears most of the time. The bloodstains were fresh. The villagers recoiled in shock, their faces pale with horror as the full weight of what had happened became clear. These are Mama Mema's clothes, one woman cried, her voice shaking. She must have been here before she died. The priest, he's responsible. The discovery was like a spark that ignited the fury of the villagers. Their suspicions were no longer whispers, they were truth. We need to call the police, an elder said urgently. This is a crime. Father Nduka is guilty. We must report this. Someone ran to the police station, and soon the officers arrived, led by the town's chief. The priest was swiftly arrested, his face pale as the reality of the situation began to sink in. He was handcuffed and escorted to the police vehicle, while the villagers looked on in stunned silence. At the police station, Father Nduka was interrogated. He initially denied any wrongdoing, but the evidence was overwhelming. The bloodied clothes, the suspicious circumstances surrounding Madame Emma's death, and the dog's behavior. All of it pointed to him. Under pressure, Father Nduka finally broke. He confessed to the horrifying truth. I didn't want her to have the child, he admitted, his voice trembling. Madame Emma was pregnant after I raped her, and I didn't want anyone to know. I poisoned her food. I tried to make her miscarry. I had to make sure she didn't tell anyone. Tears welled up in Father Nduka's eyes, but his remorse was hollow, his voice cold. He described in chilling detail how he had carried out the crime, how he had buried the bloodied clothes in his yard, and how he had staged Madame Ma's death to look like she had died in her sleep. The police were horrified by his confession, but they weren't finished. As they continued to investigate, they discovered more horrifying truths. Father Nduka had been involved in similar incidents at other places he had served. He had raped and impregnated several young girls in the other villages he had been assigned to, using his position of power to exploit them. His actions had gone unnoticed for years, but now in Shikondo, he had finally been caught. The evidence of his past crimes came to light, and it was clear that Father Nduka's reign of terror was far from over. The police had enough to charge him with multiple counts of rape, assault, and murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, and the families of his victims received compensation for the suffering he had caused. As for Madame Emma, her memory lived on in the hearts of the villagers. Her dog was given a special place in the community, and the people of Shikondo vowed never to forget what had happened, and to honor the courage of the animals who had brought the truth to light. If this story has made you angry like it did to me, Leave your response in the comment section. What moral lesson have you learned from this story? Let's continue the conversation in the comment section. Thank you so much for watching. See you in the next video.